So, well, technical difficulties are a perfect tee up, Karl, to the and why we're so delighted that you decided to come back and chat with us more about systems thinking and how that is at least one of the methodologies to put on the table to take a serious look at solving the world's most complex problems. Right? It's just one way, but it is a deep way with that we all feel needs another look. So as a science fiction author, one of the things, and as a science fiction devotee, I was thinking about who the heroes of so many stories are. Like, what is the personality profile?
Mm.
And there's often a MacGyver kind of aptitude, which is another way of saying polymath without saying polymath, right? We think that person is cool because they know a bunch of stuff, or they're willing to try things really fast, or like what, right? So I wanted to start today with, I think of you as a polymath, but why do I think of you as a polymath? Is that because you're curious about everything? Is that because you have deep knowledge in a bunch of areas because you've researched it, right? There's that bridge between Karl the person and for you for a moment to speak not just as a science fiction author, but as someone who thinks about big problems, right? So what's your background, Karl, that got you in that place? Did you go to school for physics, science? What brought you to this?
That's a really interesting question because I'm often asked about my physics background, and I have to admit that my last math mark was in grade 11, when I got 30%, which is something of an accomplishment. I mean, it's very hard to get less than 50% in anything, but I did manage. And I am possibly neurologically incapable of doing math. I can't look at two numbers and see them, the differences between them. I can't relate numbers that way. I have only a primitive understanding of algebra and never got past that. Nonetheless, I've been invited down to talk at the Ontario's Perimeter Institute. I've got to know people like physicist Lee Smolin over the years, and the Fields Institute, and have held my own in various conversations with mathematicians and physicists. So the question really for me is not how one becomes a polymath so much as how a high school dropout ends up having mutually beneficial conversations with theoretical physicists. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we place so many restrictions on ourselves, both personally and socially, as to what we're entitled to think about, and what we're entitled to explore. It's interesting both in science fiction and in foresight, which are my two areas. There's a certain overlap in personality, and in foresight, for instance, because to date there has been no sort of accreditation that you could get to be a foresight professional. People came to it from all manner of different backgrounds. I've known economists who went into it, military strategists who went into it, business people, physicists and mathematicians, computer people. It attracts a certain kind of mind from all different directions, but because it doesn't have its own sort of known core skill set. People bring to it whatever they bring to it. And because they don't perceive that there are boundaries, they end up exploring and wandering in directions that they might otherwise not. And that ability to explore without limitation is really the key thing. You get that in science fiction writers too. So for instance, because I'm a science fiction writer, I have no boundaries on what I can think about and write about. And therefore, I'm currently working on the problem of what civilization is going to follow ours. What does the civilization that follows late capitalist, industrialist, post-colonial North America, Europe, and globalization, what does that look like? I get to ask that question because I have no discipline. I have no core competence, right? And that vagueness or lack of accountability even is a huge asset.
So do you have any thoughts on, so right, this is an audience of I think of Polyplexus as a community of researchers and funders and policymakers, right? So at core, many subject matter experts, many of whom have a interdisciplinary, at least yen or interest, some probably true polymaths, who I hope to have dinner with someday, right? But do you have any thoughts for the wider group of us who are interested or curious about many things, but maybe don't have the imagination discipline that a science fiction writer has in terms of throwing out and doing full-blown world building? But do you have any thoughts on how to translate the process, if you will, of the thought experiments that a science fiction author and a foresight professional, it's good discipline, can apply to the not only real world, but the specific problems that folks that are on this call or listen, are working on? How would you tell somebody else to apply any of that to something they're working on, not just?
I think I'd like to get to that, but first of all, I'd kind of like to ask a counter question, because there is something I'm genuinely curious about. And that is that it has always been my habit to read things that I don't understand. And it's always been my habit to wander into a library, find a book in an area that I've never heard of, grab a technical text from it, pull it down and read it. And, fully aware that I will only get a vague gist of a lot of it. Now, what I want to know is whether you guys do that too.
I try to put myself in rooms where I suspect people are smarter than I am, right? And drop into lectures at conferences where, like you, right? I figure if I get a little bit of that particle physics talk, I'm the better for it, and I'm wildly entertained.
You see, how I became a high school dropout was because in high school I discovered the university library in my hometown, and I began wandering into the library. Well, skipping classes to be specific, to go to the university library and wander the stacks and grab a random selection of books. This was when I wasn't out with my friends, doing the usual playing hooky sorts of things. But just grabbing random books from all over the place. So I remember, for instance, I think I was 16 or something, just going into the library, finding a book on temporal logic, how to use temporal terms in formal logic. And I figured it out, right? And then I thought, well, how would I apply that sort of thing? Because I was actually taking a computer course at the same time. This was back in the Iron Age, when we were all using key punches and punch cards and things like that. And said, so how do I translate this notation into Fortran and create a time-based logical structure? And it's like, oh, that's kind of cool. Okay, now I've learned that. Throw that away. Find another book and keep exploring. That's the sort of universal process. It's just called curiosity, right? But curiosity.
It's a difference between being curious and being an autodidact, right?
Yes, and I think that the key important characteristic is being unafraid of not understanding.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just that you're afraid to be wrong. I mean, as a science fiction writer, I'm professionally wrong, right? And also foresight is in a great to a great degree also being professionally wrong. You can't predict the future, right? So you can't really set out to do that, but you can set out to have interesting conversations about the future that potentially change how people prepare for it. And in the course of doing that, you get to be wrong. In writing science fiction, you are always wrong. So there's no pressure. And
it's coherence to the thought experiment. I mean, to me, I always, people ask me why I'm so obsessed with science fiction. I'm like, at its best, they are robust thought experiments that should be in a philosophy class, right?
They absolutely can, but they are also not required to play by the same rules. So just to sort of extend that, I'll tell you how I got into strategic foresight to begin with. And that was that about 20 years ago, I got invited down to Ottawa, where the National Science Council was running a foresight exercise. Now, I was called in my capacity as a science fiction writer, and I was very curious to know why. So I talked to Jack Smith, the organizer, when I got there. And he basically, just to compress his description of my job description, he said, basically, you're here to be the wackiest person in the room. You don't even have to say anything. You just have to be here and be automatically the person who's most crazy, right? Whose ideas are going to be most ridiculous and most extreme and most this and most that. And the reason that you're here is because what we have here is a room full of quants, of policy wonks, of engineers and professionals, all of whom have been trained their entire lives not to speculate. And we are going to spend 3 days asking them to speculate. And they are going to be terrified to step out of their comfort zone and make a creative or a suggestion that they can't back up, right? So your job is to go wild and make the suggestions that are crazy enough that gives them permission to step out of their comfort zone a bit, go a little further than they otherwise would.
Yeah. So that steers me to where I want to go of, at the core of even discussing methodologies like the basket of systems thinking and even professional foresight techniques is this underlying crux that I feel like is hammered out of, at least in the Western world. I can't vouch for some places, but is the core of critical thinking, right? To even, I mean, I've talked to a lot of scientists over the last 9 months about how the pathways to critical thinking are blocked and how we need to rethink how to do that earlier in problem framing, in scientific inquiry, in not being so down chutes. So there's again, so the forks in the road are, there's a difference between prompting imagination and play, which I believe is absolutely critical as a human dynamic for wild ideas and going beyond and not just trying to please the teacher, like most brainstorming sessions in most corporations everywhere in the world today, having brainstorming sessions that basically just flatter the extroverts and don't really get wild new thinking. But can you let's talk a little bit about the difference between imagination and critical thinking. And because I think that some people listening think you have to have the imagination, the creativity of somebody who could grow up to be a science fiction author or is artistic or is something else. And so
yeah, no, I've been thinking about this too, because everything that I just described about my working method for learning is functionally identical to what someone deeply interested in QAnon might do.
Oh dear. Okay.
Right. I mean, yeah. I would love to hear from the group whether they can tell what the distinction is between my wandering into a library and pulling out books and looking for really interesting stuff and starting to make connections in my mind, and someone wandering the internet looking for Q-related possibilities and connections and putting them together to enlarge their own imaginative narrative of how the world works. So for me, the question has to do with how do you anchor this activity in reality somehow, right? Critical thinking for me is always has to do with coming back to reality, and my entire all my work in one way or another has to do with the idea of what I call the dignity of the real, the idea that there is a separate objective reality out there that's very, very hard for us to get at, but it is there. And how we connect our thoughts and our actions back to that reality is ultimately, the important thing in thinking. We can debate how many angels dance on the head of a pin, right? We can have all kinds of Q-related conversations about this or that element of the grand conspiracy, whatever it is at the moment. But how do you find your way back to the real? I'd like to say science fiction is about that, but it really isn't. This is something that I encountered more when I started doing the foresight work, but it's become my central obsession in my science fiction as well.
I always think it's about how to maintain the discipline or the habit of asking yourself and your team harder questions, uncomfortable, rethink it. Nobody wants to hear that maybe you need to start all over, right? Design thinking sort of brought that into the consciousness of problem framing, but I have yet to see that actually implemented in real practice beyond workshops. Right?
Yeah, if I can go back 200 years at this point, the basic idea of Hegel's dialectic, people think it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but he never used that formulation. And in fact, the way that he uses it and describes it is that you start with an abstract idea. You start with, oh, I understand that. And then you try and implement something related to it in reality, or you try and explain it to somebody, or you try and otherwise elaborate it. And suddenly you go, oh, wait a minute. that actually doesn't make sense when you put these pieces together, and you fall further and further down the rabbit hole of that idea, and find that it connects to other things that either anchor it more firmly and change it at the same time, or show you that it was bogus to begin with. That is what is called dialectics. And it's the reason that people get it wrong is because they look for easy formulations. There's no formula for doing that. It's a description of an exploratory space that you enter. You start with oh, I understand that. And you end up with, wow, right? I had no idea I was going to end up here, entirely on the other side of the planet from where I started, by actually pulling the threads of what I thought I understood. And you're right, it has to do with asking uncomfortable questions, or being asked uncomfortable questions, and digging at foundations of things that you thought were absolutely firm. And I think that might be the difference when it comes to something like QAnon, is that the intellectual activity going on there is digging at everything except that set of initial premises that you've decided are true, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have never actually queried oh, I understand that part that you started with. You've just gone off in all directions from there.
So to my cavalier broadcast to ask you how systems thinking, and the polymaths may be dancing around it, can save the world, your fiction has a lot of environmental science and cultural and framing, and that obviously sets up a cascade of interlocking systems that you're commenting on. When you think of systems and think of the fate of the planet and humanity, which obviously you do, are you consciously looking to make your audience aware of those systems, those nesting systems, and the interconnectedness?
Yeah, generally, yeah, and it's a dangerous move to make, because with science fiction, you're always walking the tightrope between sort of entertainment and enlightenment, right? You want to present a new idea, but you also want to have fun. And sometimes you decide, well, forget the idea, I'm just going to have fun. Which is perfectly fine, right? In fact, it's a great way to make a living. But ideally, you walk that tightrope in such a way that you allow people exits from the story. In other words, you get them to say, oh, that's interesting, I never thought of that. Maybe I'll look that up later, or maybe I'll think about this later, but let's get on with the action, right? Mm-hmm. And you don't, in other words, stop and lecture like we used to do in science fiction. Jules Verne, had entire interchapters where he would explain marine biology in the middle of the so the Nautilus is sinking to the bottom of the ocean, and he stops for a chapter to discuss the benthic organisms that live down there, and then we resume the action, right? You don't want to do that. What you want to do is
like there's some recent science fiction that's a lot about math lectures, but
yes, exactly. You want to make the reader aware that stuff is there so that they can explore it if they want. But it's not your job to be the lecturer. If you want to lecture on math, then lecture on math. As Napoleon said, if you want to take Vienna, right?
But in a schema sort of way, and science fiction as just an aside and an illustration, there's this whole series is about how having a better articulation and comfort level with the discomfort of playing with both seeing the unseen order around systems is useful for confronting this next stage, these last mile, these complex world problems. I'm curious how Karl, who shows up with all that background, how you think of systems, how you approach that in your foresight practice.
Yeah, to me, the idea of reframing is extremely important. So for the recent work that I did, which showed up in my novel Stealing Worlds and a few short stories, I was really concerned with the idea of reframing the issues around the global emergency, biodiversity loss, global warming, these things, in such a way as to change our perception of whether we could manage them as problems. So I took a couple approaches on that. The main one was to become consciously aware of the idea of humans as agent and everything else as passive or reactive, and basically recast the drama as a play with many different actors, humans being one of them, but all kinds of other systems and parts of systems as being players. And in the novel Stealing Worlds, that is literally what I do. I give the different players artificial intelligences that think they are those players, lakes that think they are lakes, forests with AIs that think they are that forest, and turn the global emergency into a literal drama full of actors and politics, and transform geophysics into politics. Yeah, quite literally, through an act of science fiction. And that kind of reframing is incredibly useful, because you then start to realize where you are making assumptions about active agents and passive matter, right? And begin to think of the physical world and the parts of the physical world as dynamic actors in their own rights, with agendas, perhaps, with an influence on politics. And you start saying, oh, well, if there's a drought in Central Africa, that is a political act, right? That's politics. If there are water shortages in South Africa, that's politics. That's a political thing, as well as being geophysical or whatever else it is. So for me, the reframing creates a new set of structures that I can think with, a new set of ways of approaching the problem. And it's also very, very rich. I'm finding that I'm continuing to write stories with these ideas, and I'm not exhausting them.
You find from since AI and there's so much imagination around artificial intelligence, that idea, from Hal onward and all over. And I know there's some AI experts on with us right now. Do you have, is AI one of the things you hear the most from people about?
Yes, and I've found a way to reframe that as well. That's much richer, because with the Terminator or robot revolution future vision of AI, or the Matrix, for instance, all of these visions of artificial intelligence are of it as being an active agent that is some kind of rational economic actor like us. It wants to maximize its own, utility. It wants to take over. It wants to destroy us. It has its own self-interest in mind. So, okay, human beings have evolved out of, 350 million years of animal ancestors to have desires and urges and drives and so on and so forth. But artificial intelligence has not.
Well, it's old.
It's this old, and it does not want the way that we want. It also doesn't have the sense of identity that is drilled into us right down to the cellular level. We've had, literally 3.5 billion years of developing our sense of identity, whereas AI has not. So here's the question. Why should an AI identify with itself? Why should an AI think?
Some of you on the line, by all means, chime in here. Type in, or Shelley, you're welcome to unmute yourself.
Right. So in other words, the crucial question about an artificial intelligence, an autonomous one, is not what it wants, but what it thinks it is. And its creators have the option of deciding that. So in my recent work, I have artificial intelligences that think they are rainforests, that think they are pods of whales, that think they are, all kinds of various different natural systems. And then I say, I will accept that these artificial intelligences are rational actors and act in their own self-interest. What happens next? Well, the rainforest acts in its own self-interest. The pod of whales acts in its own self-interest. The rivers act in their own self-interest. This is not the view of artificial intelligence you get with, the robot revolution, with the Terminator future, with the Matrix. This is something completely different because you've come at it from a slightly different angle. And again, it's that level of reframing that I guess is typical of my way of working. I can give you another concrete example. A few years ago, I decided I wanted to write a Star Wars or Star Trek type space opera. Where the hero gets on a starship, travels to another world, has adventures, and then comes home for dinner, sort of thing, right? And then I said, okay, I'm gonna do this, but I'm gonna set myself a design constraint. And the design constraint is I want to have this universe, but faster than light travel is not allowed.
Okay.
Right. Which immediately makes it impossible, right? Because you can't hop on a ship, fly to Alpha Centauri, and then come home for dinner. It's simply not allowed. But by introducing the design constraint and the requirement, I started that creative process. And this is, again, typical of the way I work. How do I solve that problem? How do I have my cake and eat it for this? And I eventually wrote a book called Lockstep, which won one award and was nominated for a few others. And in the Lockstep, you can't travel faster than light. But what happens is your entire civilization hibernates for 30 years, then wakes up for a month, and then hibernates for 30 years. And they do it in lockstep on all the different worlds that they live on. And that means that it can take you 30 years to travel to Alpha Centauri, slower than light travel. But since you and the rest of the civilization have all been asleep for that 30 years, when you wake up, it's the next day as far as you're concerned and as far as they're concerned. So then you have your adventures, you get in the starship at the end of your month and you fly back, and only 1 month has passed back home. The truth.
I love it.
Right. So it's a design solution rather than creating some new physics or, coming to a different kind of typical science fictional solution to that problem. And I do that kind of thing all the time.
I mean, I can't just step on something and, portals and wormholes, they solve so many transitions.
But it's so much more interesting when you don't use that, right?
Right. When you have to figure out something else. right?
Yes, and
Right.
that's what I think of as design thinking, which is a much abused and overused term, way too vague to be useful at this point. But the principle of design is, again, to take this set of requirements, this basket of requirements, some of which may be completely contradictory, and reframe it until you find a way in.
We've got a question here in the chat from Shelley Blake Clock. It says, "Is AI, wait, here we go, is AI independent of humanity, or is AI as human as elbows and thumbs? In other words, is AI an alien life form, or is it a type of humanity?"
You're not going to like this, but my answer to that would be yes. I see humanity as alien to itself, to begin with. My whole notion of humanity is, individually, I'm a big fan of the cognitive science of inaction. Um, Sociologically, I like distributed cognition and similar ideas. I think of human beings as smeared out over their environment, not as, inhabiting their bodies or their brains. We are the things we do, but also the things that we interact with, and this is also true of us sociologically. So AI is just, more of the same. If you read Andy Clark, he has great examples about that in talking about extended mind theory, the idea of the notebook, the paper notebook, as an extension of your own mind. And
Well, Fritjof Capra would say that the mind is a process.
yes, but and not something that's isolated inside the skull, which is the main point. So AI, like say bureaucracy, can be seen as an extension of the mind. So I don't make a distinction between an AI that's instantiated in silicon, and a 19th century bureaucracy that involves a brick building and people writing things on paper. Same thing. There's a great science fiction book by Sean McMullen called Souls in the Great Machine, which is about a literal computer made up of human beings who all act as the numerical registers and so forth. They write a number on a piece of paper, pass it to the guy in the booth next to them, who does an add or a subtract operation and passes it on to the next person. None of them know what they're doing individually, but collectively they are a digital computer, a Turing machine like any other. So that framing allows me to think in terms of AI, but also in terms of augmented cognition as being just as interesting as AI, and potentially much more useful.
Meaning things put in my brain or to enhance my function?
Mind machine interfaces that just make it enhance our ability to think. And we actually create things like that all the time. I mean, interface design by itself is that kind of work. Imagine an augmented reality based sophisticated interface for the world, right? That allows you to just get through your day more easily. That would be augmented cognition.
An ecologist at UC Berkeley, Neo Martinez, pointed out to me recently that tools, don't underestimate how, I will circle back to AI, because I see AI as a tool right now, right? As a pretty impressive tool, but a tool. But over the history of science, tools have changed everything. So the lowly graph is pretty recent. And that when graphs became something that could be used to explain complicated things, it changed everything in that path of critical inquiry. It made conversations possible. And I think of that. I think that's true with the near science, or the near future science of some science fiction that is plausible based on physics,
Mhm.
and that we at least have some ability to postulate that we will figure out. And we're imagining what will happen when we can do X, that
Mhm.
we see happening if enough time and money is put toward it, right? Um, I see AI that way, of that
Mhm.
it is so new in so many ways, but it could be so many things. But it is really a basket of tools given some sort of persona.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
I
that.
think that.
Oh, I'm getting an echo somewhere.
No, you're okay.
Not on my end, but I'll just not listen to myself. I'll just talk. For about 20 years now, I've been writing about AI. And in my first book, I addressed a question which is still, I think, relevant, about the autonomy of AI. So a tool is a tool until it becomes autonomous. And there's a very interesting problem with AI and governing AI right now. And that is that the most interesting thing that artificial intelligence can do for us is to think differently than us. And that's arguably why we would want it. But if it thinks sufficiently differently from us to be useful, it almost certainly also thinks sufficiently differently that it cannot explain its reasoning to us.
Mm-hmm.
And that raises the question of whether we have any way of governing a system if we do not understand it. If it can't explain it itself to us, how can we control it in any way? And that in turn sort of leads to the dilemma. Either we restrict artificial intelligence to be comprehensible and what they call explainable AI. We require that we have explainable AI, and that way we can govern it. But by doing that, we cut out possibly 90 to 99% of what it's capable of doing for us.
And isn't the genie already out of the bottle on that? I mean, how?
Not really. I mean, what we have right now is not really artificial intelligence. I'm on actually a governing council or a group talking about this right now, and with some of the top experts in the field who say that we're about 80 years out from it. Which to me sounds about right. We don't even really understand what intelligence is. We don't actually understand what information is. We have a very well-developed mathematics around the transmission and reception of messages, but we don't have a theory that can tell us how a bunch of marks on the page create the representation of the Eiffel Tower in Paris in our head, right? We can completely and fundamentally lack the knowledge to do that right now. So yeah, probably 80 years out from having something like a real AI. And in the absence of that, there can be all kinds of creativity, and we can create systems that are very creative and come up with very interesting solutions for problems. But they're not what we would consider intelligent in the way that other human beings are intelligent. But yeah, it faces us with the dilemma that a truly intelligent system that was not like us would be incredibly useful in the way that aliens would be useful. we could learn so much from them because they are different. But because they are different, we would not be able to anticipate them and therefore could not control them.
I worry about this desire, whether it's projected out into the need or the function of religion and faith, or this Deus ex machina technological solution. I beware the oracle, right? Beware the trying to create the wizard. I a little bit despair over what can we do to keep human critical thinking, inquiry, MacGyvering, because in conjunction with AI as augmented cognition, and any way we want to look at that, as of right now, we want to stick around, and we want to be better at this life thing.
Yeah, and I think it's a perfectly valid ambition to have, but what we've just talked about suggests that there's a limit. There are transhumanists and posthumanists out there who strongly embrace the idea of us evolving past what we are. But again, as Arthur C. Clarke wrote in in Childhood's End, we are not likely to benefit from that. We are not likely to understand it.
Nightmare.
Yeah, and there's something that I call transdogism. If you picture your dog as a transdogist, like a transhumanist, your dog wants to become more than itself. It wants to transcend itself. So what does your dog imagine as a transcendent super dog? Something that can hear stuff going on blocks away, something with a nose so great that it can smell, flowers in the Amazon from here, something that's able to pee on every lamppost in the city simultaneously, right? It's right. Oh yeah, that would be the ultimate super dog. You go all the way back to Nietzsche to find that him pointing out that we can't look around our own corner, as he said. We can't actually imagine what would be better than us. Anything that we imagine is from the perspective of us. It's peeing on 1,000 lampposts simultaneously, right? So imagining that a transhuman entity, whether it's an AI or anything else, would be, for instance, infinitely smarter than us. Well, being smarter is the human ambition. It's what looks good from this point of view. We have no idea what any kind of objectively better entity would be like.
There's a comment here in the thread from David Ferguson. It says, "This is not my original thought, but in the 1970s, people argued about whether we were living in the space age or the nuclear age. In reality, we were living in the microchip age and the family planning age." That's interesting. So the question to you, Karl, is what technologies or social trends do you think we are failing to focus on sufficiently?
I've written about this. I wrote about it in my piece in the Hieroglyph anthology about 7 years ago. I think we only have one issue right now that matters, and that is how we govern ourselves. Because if you look around, we have all the tools to solve the planetary emergency at this point. We understand the physics of it. We understand the biology, broadly speaking. We know that we need to stop ravaging our ecosystems. And broadly speaking, we know how to do that. We know how to basically retreat from the destruction of the earth and create better cities, a green society, all of these things. We know how to do that. What we don't know how to do is how to get ourselves to do it. So in terms of technologies, I've been sort of tongue-in-cheek saying lately that what we need now, rather than cyberpunk or solar punk or you know, whatever punk, we need method punk. We need science fiction that is about ways of doing things, because that's what we lack right now. We lack a strong, socially driven inquiry into how we can do stuff better, not through technology. Forget about technology. How we live, basically, and how we make decisions, and how we settle with decisions that we're not comfortable with, and this whole range of things. Because if we were to solve those problems, everything else would fall in line. But if we don't solve those problems, nothing else helps.
And that's the core reason for this whole series of incubators, to at least start a dialogue about what is the basket of methodologies, and my assumption that it's much broader. It comes from many more disciplines, to your point of college dropout, high school drop, like many different points of view. And that's not about fairness, it's about survival. It's about having more tools. I like this idea of methods punk. I'm going to steal that. But do you have any suggestion? Okay, so you see that we need better ways. Do you have any sense of how to get there?
It's funny because I've been working on the governance issue in parallel with economics for the last few years, and I originally had them both on in my notebook page, right? So solve economics, solve government. Okay, that's my agenda for like 2016, and so I ended up writing a novel in which I invented a new kind of economics. And that was a really interesting exploration. And I'm still very happy with where I went with all of that. And at the same time, I was trying to crack the nut of governance. And I have not advanced a single step in that, because it's the hard problem. Cognitive scientists and AI people talk about consciousness as the hard problem. That's not the hard problem. Governance is the hard problem. I can think of all kinds of systems, and I regularly invent different ways of people organizing their governance. I've got them scattered through a whole bunch of books. But am I satisfied with any of them? No.
There's theoretical governance, and then there's actual governance that lives in this messy, amazing set of systems, right?
Yeah, I've got one short story. Well, actually, the one from Hieroglyph that's still taught at a couple of universities, and it's a great sort of stab at this. But do those ideas scale? Am I still happy with them 8 years on? Yeah, because I want to write the great book about 21st century governance, but all I have right now is a pile of notes, right?
Right. Well, right. So I guess the core is how to go from how do we give ourselves permission to ask unreasonable or crazy questions and push our thinking, and then there's how do we go from that to prototyping and pulling the threads out.
Yeah. Collectively, we're not really set up to do that. The nation, right? The nation state and the subunits of that don't allow for experimentation. If we had a universal basic income or universal basic assets, And then the ability to basically ensure entire cities and regions against the results of an experiment, then, we could try things. But it's exactly the same way that you can't really experiment with new organs in your own body because you need the ones you've got, and you need them to work exactly the way they do work in order to function. And as Michael has just pointed out in the chat, experiments can have negative outcomes. Yeah, doing heart surgery on yourself as an experimental procedure, that could have a negative outcome. So how do you improve the world when you can't experiment?
Well, you could argue, right? The U.S. is our system of states is very much a real-time set of experiments. Incredibly messy, but absolutely experiments. I mean, you can look around the world at successes and failures over time of nation states.
I'd like to agree with that, but I do not, in the American system, see how successes are registered and then carried forward in this experimental system. And
that's the key, is how do we go past all or nothing theory into experiments that take that's where I feel like AI could help, with just the scale of information of framing the set of systems that are affected by.
Yeah, and one of the things I've proposed is Sim World or Sim Earth on the grand scale, massive parallel simulations of the world, agent-based, that allow you to do very, very large political and economic experiments. The problem with those, of course, is that they'd be massively biased, as we're beginning to understand with the learning systems that we currently call AI. Bias is built into systems, and bias is built into simulations. So I used to think it would be a good idea. I'm not sure it would work anymore. But we are really constrained to experiment in the real world. But again, we're not really set up to do that because we don't learn from the experiments that we do. We conduct experiments and then throw the results out. And then we conduct another experiment and throw the result out. Although, we learned from the Second World War and the experiment with fascism, at least that lesson stuck for about 80 years. But on a smaller scale, on that incremental step-by-step, inching forwards way, I just don't see us doing it.
Okay, but all right, so I'm going to say back to what can we do to put ourselves in an experimental situation where we're not isolating factors. So, right, you take climate, many factors, but climate and human trafficking and migration, they seem to get studied endlessly and experimented with endlessly in policy and politics in isolation. In next month, I'll have someone here from the State Department, and we will talk about how diplomacy and those international partnerships have to, in real time, they are in systems mode, because there's nothing they do that doesn't affect 10,000 other things.
Right.
But I don't feel like we, in science or in looking at these solutions, and so it's like I'm reaching to you to help us play with how can we do better? How can we design better experiments? I guess that taking systems and use this supercomputing ability and visualization, use these things that we now have that we haven't had as tools in the past.
Yeah, well, and yes, and that's definitely the crux of the question. You know, our analytical tools up to this point have involved decomposing real world systems into isolatable subunits. And that is exactly what we can't do with the issues of greatest concern.
Right.
But what's really interesting to me is that the human beings have evolved a faculty for dealing with such multivalent systems. And I'm not the person who proposed this. If you read Alicia Herrero's book Dynamics in Action, or if you go to Brian Boyd's book on the origin of stories, you'll find a convergence of ideas there around the concept of a faculty, a human faculty for dealing with multivalent, diverse systemic events, multi-agent systems.
Mhm.
And the way Herrero puts it is that there are agent-based systems like tornadoes that are driven by, different, the convergence of multiple different causal factors that result in something that looks like an entity. And you can model these. You can see how they come together. You can see, in general, how tornadoes work. But each tornado is itself unique.
Mhm.
And that's the situation that we face, right? We can model all the parts that come together to create the situation that we're in. And we can even model an idealized war or, ecosystem collapse and so on and so forth. But each specific one of those is its own unique thing. And to understand a tornado, you need to tease it apart into two dimensions: context and history. Each tornado has its own history, its own path that it carves across the landscape, and it has the context. It has the world in which that happened. And yes, funnily enough, human beings have, over the last 100,000 years or so, developed a very sophisticated faculty for analyzing and communicating exactly that kind of process. It's called narrative.
Mm-hmm.
In narrative, what we do is we bring together diverse elements that don't fit together analytically in any other way. And we put them in motion, playing off against each other. So we have a pandemic and an unscrupulous politician, right? We put them together and we have a story. And each one of those elements, the unscrupulous politician and the pandemic, plays against the other. And we see that effect that we don't have another way of simulating. We put those together with the discovery of a new way of creating vaccines. And we put that together with, economic factors. We put that together with media. We put that together with, anti-vaxxers and so on and so forth. All of these things that by themselves, we may have a mode of analysis for, but we don't have any other natural way of combining. But when we put them together in a story, we can instantly recognize what's out of place, what doesn't fit, right? And what doesn't work in the story. And it is exactly that ability to put all these things together and intuitively and instantly say, no, that wouldn't happen, right? Or yes, that works. That is the faculty.
Do you ascribe to the theory that that's part of flow states, the neuroscience concept that in times of radical, variable, high risk situations, the human brain turns off a bunch of pieces so that information can be processed very differently to make it down that wave to, to survive whatever it is. Do you feel like we societally have it seems like times like this, pandemic, unscrupulous, so many things happening at once, that there's an opportunity for a collective flow state that is a different way of being that we can't sustain, but can get us through crises.
Well, it may be that via this faculty of narrative, we have taken elements of that flow state and harnessed them. Basically, it is fundamental systems theory or systems thinking. You are literally seeing all of the different things playing off against each other. The person in a place with a problem, the things facing against them, their history, what's possible in that environment. All of these things are all there simultaneously in your mind. And new elements can be added or subtracted almost arbitrarily. And the complexity can be arbitrary. Ask somebody who's a Game of Thrones fan about, some particular aspect of the history of those characters and story. It's immensely complex, but a fan will be able to tell you, all those details. It's like facial recognition, where we have this amazing ability to detect tiny, tiny differences in faces. With narrative, we can instantly tell tiny, tiny discrepancies in what is plausible and what is not plausible. So narrative is the supreme sort of systems tool. And it gets a bad rap, of course, because it's primarily used as an entertainment module. But we essentially communicate everything. Brian Boyd says that it's the primary way that the human mind understands things. If we can understand things in narrative terms, we automatically will.
I'm loving Michael Monroe's comments in here. Flow state is a bunch of short circuits built to avoid being selected out of the gene pool.
So is everything, really.
But it brings up the thought of, I have friends who have been working really hard to understand how we can trigger flow states for complex problem solving, right? Mm-hmm. For that enhanced state, that altered state of, but it's interesting, you can't concentrate your way into it.
No.
Whereas we could come up with a set of prompts for a systems conversation, or there's some things you can prompt and some things you can think harder about and get to. And then there's others, something like flow states where it's more of a letting go.
Yes. Well, right at the beginning of our conversation, I talked about turning the global emergency into a set of actors on a stage. Mm-hmm. And that is the process, is that you enter the drama rather than concentrate on the problem. You daydream your way into the situation. And a situation is just another kind of narrative. Michael, there's no medication. We all know how to do this from birth. It is a matter of, it's hard for me to say because I'm like in that state most of the time. But it is letting go of all your analytical tools and just seeing what is out there in the world, seeing what the world that you're talking about is. Put a character into it, right? Let them walk around. Let them try and have a day. What happens to them? That's why in foresight so often we express complex foresight results, like scenario results, by writing foresight fictions, mm-hmm. short dramas or stories that allow someone to say, oh, that's what this scenario means. Just laying down all the different elements of it doesn't work. You have to put them in motion as the narrative for people to have that aha moment. And also for them to engage critically, because then they can see the discrepancies.
So as you have looked at the intractable issue of governance, have you thought about it in cycles, that there's cycles of progress in the grand human experiment of governance? And then there's long periods of time, basically a system is put in place, whatever it is. And then the entropy over time has it fall apart. And then then there's something else. It feels like societally, culturally, species wise, we do a whole lot in little bursts. Maybe politics and war and technology driven, that trifecta, but then there's long periods until we have to face it, and that we're coming smack up on so many giant things happening at the same time. Something's got to give. Some big changes, good or bad, are coming. We're in it.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, like, I really don't believe in cyclic history. It requires the existence of stable entities that people have never been able to explain to me what those would be. But I strongly suspect that what will happen with the future of governance is that the old system will remain and simply become irrelevant as we start to conduct more and more of our decision making and our work in another realm. And also, this is highly desirable because I'm a Canadian. We did not come to democracy through a revolution. We negotiated our way to a democracy. Mm-hmm. We spent decades at it, but it worked, right? There's more than one way to do things, but in a lot of ways, we got to being a full democracy by smiling and nodding at the people in power and saying, "Yep, we'll obey you. We recognize you, King." You know. Queen Victoria, yeah, you're the sovereign, yeah. Now let's go down and make the decisions, right? in Parliament and locally as we're doing, and the old way just withered away. I suspect the same thing is likely to happen, but I can't tell you what the system that is going to replace what we have now is going to look like.
Yeah, no, I'm not asking you to predict, even though I called you a futurist. It's an unfair moniker. Hi, Diva. So as we're wrapping up here, and thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties today, everybody on the line. Do you have any parting thoughts on thinking about systems, like questions that we should be asking ourselves, or particular things that are floating in your world for better problem framing, for that apply, right?
I don't think I can give you a satisfying answer to that. What I can tell you is that,
Karl, nobody can.
Yeah, what I can tell you is that I'm really interested in systems thinking as an alternative to causal thinking. Mm-hmm. And I'm very interested in acausal theories of nature right now. And we have plenty of them. Things don't fall down because of there's a law of nature that makes them do that. According to relativity, things fall down just because they're moving in a straight line. They're moving in a straight line in a curved spacetime. And that's different from saying they were caused to go down. Did you know that there is always 2 points on the Earth's equator opposite one another that are exactly the same temperature?
I did not.
Yes, always.
8 years old when I learned that.
Right. And people will look at that and say, I wonder what causes that. But there is no cause. It's not something that occurs as the result of a cause and effect relationship of any kind. It is inherent to the sort of way the world is put together as a thing. To give you a really simple example, so I give you a jar full of marbles, different colored marbles. And every time you reach in and pull out 3, 2 of them are the same color. You might say, huh, so what law is causing, 2 of these marbles, at least 2 of these marbles, and sometimes all 3 to always be the same color? And you could bang your head against the wall thinking about the theory that would get you to something like that. But in fact, the answer is simple. There's only two colors of marble.
Right.
Right. So the situation is what results in that. And that kind of acausal thinking is what fascinates me the most right now. I'm writing a time travel story based around that sort of thing right now. But the urge to look for causes rather than to look at a total situation and see that things are happening because of the total situation. That's a bad tendency. Always looking for causes. We may take something apart into the various systems, parts that are interacting, but we might still make the mistake of thinking about those as causing changes, whereas in fact it may simply be the arrangement of the whole, like the marbles in the jar that are creating the results that we see in the real world.
I love it. That's a great place to wrap up. And I would invite you, Karl, and all of you on the line to join us next week. We have Bruno Andrade Sanchez Nuno, the principal scientist at Microsoft AI Earth, who we'll put on the hot seat to talk about AI's role in systems. And what he thinks. Does he think it's 80 years out? But what does he think it can best do and can't do? Right? We'll break through some of that. And also Edie Farwell, where we'll talk about systems approach to leadership training and to the governance in philanthropy. How can philanthropy act to be a good actor in global systems? And to have that sensibility. Again, different angles of looking at systems approaches to change, right? To solutions, to perspective. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate your patience with our technical difficulties, and for joining us and for some great questions. All right.
Thanks a lot, everybody. And thank you, Laura.
Talk to you soon, Karl.
Yeah. Goodbye.